Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a pretty extreme scenario. It's one that really forces you to look at, well, how we think about Earth's resources versus the reality of how they're actually spread out.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about water, the most basic thing there is.
Absolutely fundamental.
And specifically the numbers behind it, the numbers that show just how maybe vulnerable our modern world really is.
It's a critical thing to look at, I think. We tend to see Earth as, the blue planet, right? We assume water is just everywhere,
Right.
limitless.
Right.
But when you actually break down the figures, the amount of water that we can actually use for drinking, for farming, day to day, it's statistically, almost negligible.
Negligible. Wow.
And that makes our reliance on it incredibly precarious.
That's exactly the framework for this deep dive. The source material we're using today is, well, it's a bit unusual. It combines hard, real-world data, water percentages, lake volumes, that sort of thing.
Standard hydrology, yeah.
But it pairs it with this really profound speculative analysis. It tries to project what would happen globally if there was a sudden massive contamination event.
And the scenario is very specific in the source.
Very.
It uses this analogy of a star falling from the sky. And this star makes 1/3 of the world's accessible drinking water. Bitter, toxic, basically unusable almost instantly.
Instantly. That's the key part.
It is. It's a model, really,
Yeah.
designed to simulate the societal breakdown, the geopolitical shifts that would happen under that kind of extreme immediate scarcity.
So our mission today is to follow that logic, starting with the big picture, the geometry of water, the source puts it, and then drilling down into the political fallout. We're not just looking at an environmental crisis here. The core question the source is asking is, how does taking away 1/3 of our drinking water, just like that, completely reshape global power? How could it, enable a whole new kind of centralized world government?
Exactly. We need to track that argument carefully. Start with the shocking reality of how little usable water there actually is.
Right.
Then pinpoint the geographical bottlenecks where could contamination do the most damage most efficiently.
The choke points.
The choke points. And finally, analyze these two competing theories the source presents about who gets hit. Is the target the center of power, or is it a more vulnerable region? And what does that choice tell us about the goals of this controlling regime the text describes?
Okay, let's get into it. This is a crucial projection to unpack. Okay, let's start with the basics, the hard numbers. When you look at Earth from space, it's mostly blue, right? About 71% covered in water.
Seems like a lot.
It does. But we need to isolate the stuff we can actually use. So of that 71%, how much is actually fresh water?
It's surprisingly small. Only about 3% of all the water on Earth is fresh.
3%, okay.
Now, most people get that, oceans are salty. But the real kicker is in the next step. People tend to vastly overestimate how much of that 3% is actually available for us to drink or use for crops.
This is where the numbers start getting, frankly, a bit scary. Because something like 98.8% of that fresh water is effectively off limits for immediate use.
That's right. It reveals just how much we depend on a tiny, tiny fraction.
So let's break down that unusable bulk. Where is most of that 3% fresh water hiding?
Well, the biggest chunk, almost 70%, 68.7% to be precise, is locked up as ice. Think glaciers, ice caps, permanent snowfields.
Okay, massive volume, but frozen solid.
Exactly. And getting it, melting it, transporting it for mass consumption, the logistics are just staggering.
Why is that considered unusable in this kind of crisis scenario? I mean, people talk about melting ice caps as a resource, maybe.
Well, theoretically, maybe long-term, but in the context of a sudden mass contamination event affecting billions, no, it's basically unusable.
Okay.
Why not?
Okay.
A couple of reasons. First, it's mostly at the poles or high up in mountains. Getting it to where people actually live, processing it. It needs huge amounts of energy and infrastructure we just don't have ready to go.
Right. Not a quick fix.
Not at all. And second, even if we could tap into it quickly, accelerating glacier melt on that scale would have its own disastrous long-term consequences. But crucially, it doesn't solve the immediate problem of thirst in populated areas right now.
So it's fresh water, but just not strategically accessible for drinking water right away.
Precisely. It's inaccessible as a current strategic supply.
Okay, so that's nearly 70% of the fresh water locked in ice, almost 2/3 gone. What about the rest, that remaining third or so?
That remaining portion, about 30.1% of the total freshwater, is groundwater. We're talking deep underground aquifers.
Which sounds safer, maybe, hidden away.
It sounds safer, yeah. But accessing it and using it strategically in a sudden crisis faces its own major hurdles.
Okay, like what What are the challenges with groundwater if, say, a third of the surface water suddenly becomes unusable?
Well, first, recharge rates. A lot of the biggest aquifers contain what's called fossil water. It collected over thousands, maybe millions of years.
So it doesn't refill quickly.
Exactly. Some barely refill at all. Pumping it out quickly means you're basically mining it. It's not sustainable. Second, the cost and energy needed to drill down, sometimes hundreds or thousands of feet, and pump that water up is way higher than using surface water.
More expensive, more difficult.
Much more. And finally, and this is really important for the scenario we're looking at, groundwater moves very slowly. If suddenly a third of the world needs a new water source now, drilling enough wells, accessing enough deep aquifers globally to replace that lost volume in a short time, it's just logistically impossible.
So when you have the ice, the 68.7%, and the groundwater, the 30.1%.
You get to that 98.8% figure.
Yeah.
That much of the world's freshwater is, for the purpose of immediate large-scale crisis relief, essentially inaccessible.
Which leaves, what, just over 1%?
Even less. It brings us to the absolute crux of this whole analysis. The water humanity generally relies on day in, day out is surface water, rivers, lakes, marshes.
Yeah.
And that readily accessible surface water makes up only 0.3% of all the water on Earth.
0.3%?
Yes. Less than half of 1%. That tiny sliver is the strategic resource we depend on.
Wow.
And therefore, according to the source material, it's the primary target if you wanted to cause catastrophic disruption through contamination.
When you put it like that, the vulnerability is, yeah, it's staggering. The margin for error is almost zero.
It really is.
Okay, so now we need to look inside that critical 0.3%.
Wow.
Because even within that tiny fraction, the source says there's a huge concentration in one particular type of source.
Yes, this next step is vital to understand the logic behind the contamination scenario. If the goal is to instantly take out 1/3 of the drinking supply, you have to hit the biggest, most efficient target.
So what makes up that 0.3%?
Well, the distribution is very uneven. Think about rivers. We see them flowing. They seem important.
Yeah, major rivers seem huge.
They seem huge, but they account for a surprisingly small amount of the total accessible surface water, just 2%.
Only 2%.
Only 2%. Then you have swamps, marshes, they hold about 11%. But both rivers and marshes are very dynamic. Their volume changes a lot with weather, seasons. They're also spread out, which makes deliberately contaminating a huge portion of them difficult.
Okay, so if rivers are 2% and swamps are 11%, that's 13%. Where's the rest? The vast majority.
Lakes.
Lakes.
Lakes hold a massive 87% of the stable, liquid surface freshwater that humanity uses, especially for big cities, large-scale farming industry.
87%. So most of our usable surface water isn't flowing. It's just sitting there in big pools.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
In relatively few, very large, deep depressions on the Earth's surface. That's the lopsided geography of our drinking water supply.
Okay, now I see the connection to the contamination scenario in the
Right.
source. The event has to make 1/3 of the drinking water unusable.
Right.
And if 87% of that critical 0.3% is concentrated in lakes,
Then hitting the lakes is the most effective way to achieve that goal. It's about logistics and maximizing impact. If you want rapid, massive disruption, you don't go after scattered rivers or hard-to-reach groundwater.
you go for the big bucket.
You go for the 87% bucket, the world's giant freshwater lakes. Contaminate a significant portion of that volume, and you achieve the 1/3 global disruption efficiently.
The source did mention a couple of other possibilities, alternative views. We should probably touch on those. What about groundwater contamination?
It addresses that. The source basically questions how likely it is that a sudden event, something falling from the sky, like the star analogy, could contaminate 1/3 of the world's hidden groundwater all at once.
Seems unlikely, yeah.
Very unlikely for a rapid, widespread effect. Now, it does acknowledge that pollution in general affects groundwater and that the source material it's analyzing mentions the event affecting rivers and the sources of water springs. That phrasing suggests a link, surface water contamination quickly hitting nearby springs and shallow wells.
So there's a connection, but the main hit has to be the surface.
Yes. The primary catastrophic disruption, the one that achieves the 1/3 reduction quickly, has to focus on that concentrated 87% in the lakes.
What about the Amazon River? The source mentioned that view, too. It carries something like 20% of the world's total freshwater runoff. That sounds like a massive target.
It's an absolutely colossal river system, no doubt. And contaminating the Amazon would be devastating for South America, and it would mess with ocean salinity, weather patterns, huge consequences.
Yeah.
But the source comes back to the difference between total runoff and the stable, usable drinking water supply that large populations rely on consistently. The Amazon's flow, while huge, serves a relatively low-density population spread across its massive basin compared to, say, the Great Lakes region.
Ah, okay. So it's not just volume, it's about population density and dependency.
Exactly. The argument for targeting the lakes is that they represent the 87% concentration serving the most densely populated industrial and agricultural centers globally. Hitting the lakes maximizes the immediate catastrophic impact on the societies most dependent on large, stable water resources.
Okay, that makes sense. So the key takeaway from this whole geometry section is, well, it's pretty stark. 98.8% of fresh water is basically out of the picture in a sudden crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Our survival hangs on that tiny 0.3% surface supply.
Right.
And because 87% of that is concentrated in just a few massive lakes, those lakes become the logical, maybe the only targets if your goal is to use water contamination to cause global chaos.
That's the core argument. Yes, the geography dictates the strategy.
Okay, so if the most efficient way to take out a third of the world's drinking water is by targeting the huge freshwater lakes at 87% concentration,
Right.
we need to know which lakes, where are these massive strategic hubs. The source material is very specific here. It filters down thousands of lakes in the world based on some pretty strict criteria.
That filtering process is key. It's not just any lake. The text explicitly excludes saltwater bodies first. The Caspian Sea is huge, for instance, but it's salty. Can't drink it.
Okay, so saltwater lakes are out. What else?
It also excludes lakes that are too small, obviously, or too shallow, they might not hold enough volume, or lakes that vary too much seasonally, or freeze over too often, or for too long. The focus is on lakes that are consistently deep, vast, and strategically located to provide the kind of volume needed to represent a chunk of the global supply.
So after all that filtering, how many major targets are left?
The analysis narrows it down to 3 primary clusters, 3 major freshwater hubs. These are the geographical choke points for global surface water access, according to this source.
3 choke points. Okay, we need to go through them. What are they? What's their scale? And crucially, who depends on them?
Let's start with the biggest cluster by sheer volume, the African Great Lakes. This mainly refers to Lake Malawi, Lake Tanganyika, and Lake Victoria.
Okay, the African Great Lakes. Give us a sense of the scale there. How much water are we talking about and how many people?
Hydrologically, this group is the giant. Their combined volume is immense, roughly 30,050 cubic kilometers. Just a staggering amount of water.
30,000 cubic kilometers. Wow.
But the strategic significance here isn't just the volume, it's the human dependency. The estimated number of people directly relying on these lakes for drinking, washing, fishing, farming right along the shores is over 200 million people.
200 million. That level of direct reliance is huge. How does that differ from, say, the way North America uses its Great Lakes?
It's fundamentally different in many ways. In North America, most water goes through treatment plants, gets piped miles away, and a huge amount goes to industry and large-scale agriculture.
Right. It's processed, managed.
Heavily managed. In the African Great Lakes region, for millions of people, the reliance is much more direct, often with minimal or no treatment. It's subsistence living tied directly to the lake. So if you contaminate this cluster...
It's not just thirst.
It's not just thirst. It's the immediate collapse of the entire regional food system. Fishing, local farming goes away overnight. It triggers an immediate, massive humanitarian crisis. Forced migration on a scale that would destabilize the entire continent and put unbelievable pressure on neighboring regions and international aid.
The sheer amount of human chaos you could generate by hitting this one spot.
Yeah.
It makes it a powerful strategic target, doesn't it?
Extremely powerful. The text frames this as potentially targeting vulnerability. You create a high-impact humanitarian disaster in a region that might have less capacity to resist or respond, overwhelming global systems, and creating perhaps a power vacuum or justification for external control.
Okay, that's the African cluster. Where's the second major target zone?
Second cluster takes us north, into Eurasia. These are the Siberian Central Asian giants. The analysis focuses primarily on Lake Baikal in Russia and also Lake Kivskol nearby in Mongolia.
Lake Baikal. I mean, that one's legendary for its size and purity, right?
It is. Baikal alone holds about 1/5, 20% of all the world's unfrozen liquid freshwater. It's incredibly significant.
Astonishing. So what's the combined volume of Baikal and Kivskol? And who relies on them directly?
Their combined volume is also huge, around 24,095 cubic kilometers. Still massive. But the immediate population dependency is much, much lower than Africa's Great Lakes. Estimates are generally over 1 million people directly reliant.
Okay, so far fewer people immediately affected compared to Africa. What does that mean strategically, according to the source, if this cluster gets hit?
It creates a different kind of impact. Contaminating Baikal doesn't cause the same immediate, massive human catastrophe as hitting the African lakes. The direct death toll from thirst might be lower initially,
Right.
but you've just removed a colossal strategic reserve of fresh water from the global equation. You've taken away future water security for major Eurasian powers like Russia and potentially China. It's less about immediate chaos and more about long-term strategic denial.
So it's like resource warfare into the future, constraining rivals down the line.
Exactly. You deny them a vital future resource, potentially forcing them into dependency later on, water controlled by whoever orchestrated the event. It removes options, limits their future power projection.
A different strategy. Less about immediate collapse, more about long-term geopolitical shaping.
Precisely.
Okay. That leaves the third cluster. This one involved the superpower nation mentioned in the source, the North American Great Lakes. We're talking Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, Ontario.
Yes, this cluster is, in many ways, the industrial, agricultural, and population heartland for both the U.S. and Canada.
What's their combined volume and the population dependency?
Their total volume is slightly smaller than the other two, but still enormous. 22,686 cubic kilometers. The direct population relying on them for drinking water is estimated at over 30 million people.
30 million. Significant, but much less than the African cluster. What makes this target unique then?
The complexity of the dependency here is the highest. It's not just drinking water for 30 million. First, industry. This region is a massive manufacturing belt. Think cars, steel, chemicals. All that industry relies heavily on Great Lakes water for cooling, processing, transport, waste dilution. Contamination shuts that down.
Okay, so industrial collapse.
Second, agriculture. The region is a breadbasket. It produces vast amounts of food corn, soybeans, dairy, feeding millions well beyond the immediate area. Contamination would devastate a huge part of the North American food supply chain.
So hitting the North American Great Lakes means simultaneous crises.
Yeah.
Thirst, industrial shutdown, and food shortages.
Exactly. It's a multi-layered catastrophe hitting a highly developed, complex society. The economic impact alone would be astronomical, and the ripple effects on global markets and supply chains would be immediate and severe.
The potential to paralyze a global superpower from within. That seems like a very high-value strategic goal.
Extremely high value. It creates this unique situation where a powerful democratic nation suddenly faces multiple existential threats all at once. This makes it a tempting target, according to the source's logic. But it's also inherently risky, precisely because it's a superpower. The potential for a strong, organized response, military or otherwise, is much higher.
A high-risk, high-reward target then.
You could say that.
So we have three potential ground zeros. Africa's Great Lakes, massive volume, huge direct human impact targeting vulnerability. The Siberian Giants, huge volume, lower immediate human impact targeting long-term resource denial. And North America's Great Lakes, slightly less volume, complex dependency, targeting the superpower's core.
That sums up the potential impact zones identified in the source.
And the source is chillingly clear about the consequence, regardless of which one is hit. It says, basically, if the water in these places becomes undrinkable,
People cannot live there, period. The region effectively becomes uninhabitable.
forcing immediate chaotic mass migration.
Yes. Whether it's 30 million North Americans or 200 million Africans, you suddenly have millions displaced, desperate, with nowhere to go. And that mass movement of people, that chaos, is precisely what the next part of the analysis focuses on. The source argues this catastrophe must happen for the geopolitical shift it describes. But where it happens depends entirely on the strategic aims of this incoming global power.
All right, so the source has laid out the hydrological vulnerability, the 0.3%, the 87% in lakes, the three main targets. Now, it gets into the geopolitics. It presents two conflicting theories about which those targets gets hit. Specifically, it pits the U.S.-Canada Great Lakes against the African Great Lakes.
That's right. And the choice between them, according to the source, isn't random. It's based entirely on which outcome best serves the agenda of the global power structure that the source anticipates is coming.
We should probably mention again, the source uses some very specific, maybe symbolic terms for this regime, the beast government, Harlot Babylon.
Yes, and it's important for listeners to know we're relaying the source's analysis and its terminology impartially here. We're not endorsing the terms, just explaining the logic presented in the text.
Understood. So the core strategic conflict boils down to. Do you destroy the current superpower to make way for the new regime, or do you preserve the superpower's infrastructure and target somewhere more vulnerable?
That's the fundamental divide between the two views presented.
Okay, let's tackle view one, targeting the superpower. This is the scenario where the star falls on the North American Great Lakes. What's the logic behind deliberately crippling the U.S.?
The core idea of view one is pretty stark. To establish this new, centralized global control system, the current dominant power identified explicitly as the U.S. must be neutralized first.
Neutralized how? Not necessarily by invasion.
No, the analysis suggests neutralization from within, through internal collapse triggered by resource denial.
Why wouldn't military force work? Why use water contamination?
The argument is that the citizens of a relatively affluent superpower, people who are generally well-fed, as the source puts it, have the resources, the democratic mindset, the independent spirit. They have the means and the will to resist being subjugated by a totalitarian regime.
They won't easily become slaves to state control, is the idea.
That's the idea. Military force might occupy, but it wouldn't necessarily break the population's underlying resistance, especially in a large, armed, and decentralized society.
So the water contamination becomes the tool to break that will.
Precisely. The source argues that this resistance has to be systematically dismantled by creating the most basic primal needs: thirst and hunger. Hitting the Great Lakes achieves both simultaneously removes the primary drinking water and cripples the food production tied to that region.
And what does the source predict happens then, when you have sudden severe scarcity in the heart of the superpower?
It forces immediate total dependence on the state or whatever entity controls the remaining resources just for survival. This extreme shortage is seen as accelerating the collapse of the democratic foundation.
How so?
Well, the idea is when people are desperate for water and food, concerns about civil liberties, free speech, checks and balances, they all become secondary, maybe even luxuries. Survival is paramount.
So control over water becomes control over the population.
Yes, it allows the state or the emerging regime to impose much stronger centralized control. According to this view, it leads directly to the effective enslavement of the superpower's citizens who trade freedom for survival.
So view one basically says American prosperity and independence are the main roadblocks to this global regime.
Exactly.
And therefore, that prosperity has to be destroyed through resource warfare to ensure compliance.
It's weaponizing desperation, essentially. If the U.S. Great Lakes are hit, the resulting chaos and need are supposed to starve the resistance into submission. This clears the path for the global regime to consolidate power without a strong, free superpower challenging it.
Okay, that's a pretty bleak outlook. Now, what about the counterargument? View two, targeting the vulnerable, which means the African Great Lakes scenario. Why would the incoming regime protect the U.S.?
View 2 starts from a different assumption about timing. It assumes the new global regime is actually very close to taking power, maybe already has significant influence.
Okay, they're almost ready to take over.
Right. And if you're about to take control globally, you need functional assets, you need infrastructure, you need strategic bases.
And the U.S., particularly the Great Lakes region, represents a massive industrial, logistical, and agricultural asset.
Exactly. So the logic here is that it would be counterintuitive, even foolish, for an incoming global power to intentionally turn the heartland of the current superpower, a place with invaluable infrastructure, into an uninhabitable wasteland right before they take charge.
Doesn't make sense to destroy the tries you're about to claim.
That's the argument. If the U.S. is meant to be a key part of the new global structure, maybe even its operational center, then its resources, its infrastructure, its food supply need to be kept intact, protected even.
So, under view two, the superpower gets spared the water crisis. Where does the contamination hit then?
It has to happen somewhere else. Somewhere that creates the necessary global crisis and distraction, but without crippling the regime's intended power base. The prediction in view 2 is that the contamination targets a more vulnerable region, specifically the African Great Lakes cluster.
Because of the huge population and maybe less resilience.
Exactly. You hit the area with the highest immediate human impact, those 200 million directly dependent people, where the resulting chaos would be immense, but perhaps less likely to directly threaten the core strategic interests of the incoming regime centered elsewhere.
What purpose would that serve? Causing such a massive humanitarian disaster in Africa?
The source suggests a couple of strategic goals for this. First, it creates a colossal diversion. A crisis so huge it consumes global attention, resources, and aid efforts, allowing the regime to consolidate power more quietly elsewhere, perhaps in the protected superpower nation.
A smokescreen.
A massive one. And second, it could allow the regime to position itself as the savior, demonstrating its ability to provide water and food security in the areas it controls, like the protected U.S., thereby attracting loyalty and control over other nations desperate for stability. Look, we have water, submit to us, and you'll survive.
Offering security as a tool of control.
Precisely.
I do have to push back a bit on view one, though. It seems to assume the U.S. government would just let this happen. Wouldn't they prioritize protecting the Great Lakes above all else if such a threat existed? It feels like a big assumption that the superpower would just collapse internally like that.
That's a very valid point, and it highlights a tension in the source material itself. View one seems to imply either that the contamination method is so sudden, so overwhelming that the government can't effectively respond. Or the more unsettling implication is that perhaps elements within the superpower structure are somehow complicit or align with the goals of the incoming regime, allowing the crisis to unfold to facilitate population control.
That's a much darker interpretation.
It is. View two avoids that complexity by just arguing for preservation of the asset. But what both views agree on, fundamentally, is that a catastrophic water crisis must occur somewhere. It's seen as a necessary trigger event.
And regardless of whether it hits the U.S. or Africa, the end result is the same in one crucial way. Water and food become the ultimate levers of power.
Absolutely. The source is emphatic about this, especially in a world already destabilized. It references prior events affecting a quarter of the earth through war, famine, disease, political upheaval, and that kind of environment. Basic necessities like water and food stop being just resources.
They become weapons.
Strategic weapons of control. They become the currency of global power, the mechanism for completely reorganizing society.
So the contamination event isn't viewed as a disaster to be managed.
No, it's seen as a manufactured crisis, an opportunity to be leveraged for a specific political outcome, a consolidation of global governance.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most disturbing part of the analysis. How this engineered dependence, this thirst and hunger, is framed as leading to a new form of slavery.
Yes, the slavery of dependence. That's the ultimate endpoint described in the source.
Okay, so this final section shifts from the where, the geography of the contamination, to the how. How does this water crisis actually translate into total control? The source argues that real lasting power isn't just about military strength.
Right. Military power can occupy territory, it can enforce compliance to a degree, but the source suggests it's costly and it constantly breeds resistance.
So what's more effective, according to this view?
Resource deprivation, specifically control over water and food, because that targets the most basic human survival instinct. It doesn't just coerce, it potentially creates willing submission out of sheer necessity.
Willing submission. That's a chilling phrase.
It is, and the source makes this very concrete. It doesn't just theorize, it draws a direct parallel to a historical, or rather biblical account. It points to the story of Joseph in Egypt during the 7-year famine, as told in Genesis chapter 47.
But the story of Joseph and the famine, how is that used here?
It's presented as a kind of historical blueprint, a step-by-step guide showing how a population faced with prolonged, inescapable resource scarcity in that case, food can be systematically led to give up everything, including their freedom, in exchange for survival.
Wow. Okay, walk us through that analogy. How does the Genesis story map onto this modern water contamination scenario?
The source highlights the sequence of surrender. The Egyptian famine wasn't sudden like the star contamination is proposed to be. It was prolonged. This forced the people into repeated negotiations with Pharaoh's government, represented by Joseph, as their own resources dwindled.
So a gradual process of losing independence.
Exactly. A staged sale of assets, marking an incremental decline into servitude. It didn't happen all at once.
What was the first thing they gave up?
First, their liquid assets. All their money. They brought all the silver and gold they had to Joseph to buy grain. This is step one. The state absorbs the economic capital of the citizens.
Okay. Private wealth goes to the government.
Right. Your ability to act independently in the economy is gone. In a modern context, you could see this as hyperinflation or the collapse of private banking, or maybe digital currency controlled entirely by the state. Anything that makes citizens totally reliant on the central authority's financial system to access basic goods.
But money runs out. especially if the crisis goes on, or if the resource, like water, is just unavailable regardless of money.
Exactly. So when their money was gone, what did they offer next? Their livestock. They traded their herds, their flocks, their donkeys, all their productive capital for another year's worth of food.
So not just money, but the means of creating future wealth.
Yes. This represents the transfer of the means of production farms, factories, technology from private hands to state control. Private enterprise, the ability to sustain yourself through your own work and assets, is eliminated. Everyone now works for or depends directly on the state's enterprises.
Okay, money gone, livestock gone, what's left?
Only two things: the land they live on and their own bodies. The third step, according to Genesis and the source's analogy, is the sale of the land. The people came back to Joseph and said, basically, we have nothing left but our land and ourselves. Buy us and our land for food.
They offered their land, their home.
Their fields, yes. The very foundation of their independence, their generational wealth, their connection to place, all of it became the property of Pharaoh, the property of the state. The source sees this as the symbolic death of democratic foundations, where private property rights vanish and everyone becomes, essentially, a tenant on state land.
That leaves only one thing left to sell.
Themselves. The final step is the surrender of their bodies. They explicitly say, buy us. We will become servants to Pharaoh. They sell their labor, their freedom, their very persons into servitude, simply to be kept alive.
They willingly choose servitude over starvation.
Because it was the only choice left. Survival overrides everything else.
So how does the source connect this gradual multi-year famine process in Egypt to the sudden water contamination scenario?
The argument is that the star contamination event, by causing such immediate and severe thirst and hunger, effectively bypasses those early stages. It collapses the system so fast that people are instantly pushed towards the endgame.
It accelerates the process dramatically.
Yes, it creates the conditions for steps 3 and 4, the surrender of land and self, almost immediately. The desperation is instant and total, leaving no time for gradual economic decline.
So the water and food shortages aren't just a consequence. They are framed as necessary tools.
Explicitly necessary, according to the text. Necessary to break resistance quickly, strengthen government control immediately, and trigger the collapse of existing democratic systems worldwide. Whether that starts in the superpower, view 1, or is managed from a protected superpower by targeting vulnerable regions, view 2, the goal is the same. Use scarcity to force submission.
Because if people are desperately searching for a cup of clean water,
They're not organizing protests, they're not debating political philosophy, their will to resist is overwhelmed by the primal need to survive.
and that need becomes the leverage for control.
The ultimate leverage. The source argues that the entity controlling the remaining 2/3 of the water supply essentially holds the power of life and death. And it can use that power to purchase the population's freedom, transitioning them from citizens into dependents, or as the source puts it, servants.
So that initial vulnerability, the fact that 87% of our usable water is in just a few spots, takes on this huge political significance. It's not just an environmental risk, it's presented as a potential mechanism for global political transformation.
Exactly. The speed and scale of the contamination hitting those lakes are crucial to the scenario. It has to be fast enough and devastating enough to short-circuit any organized democratic response, forcing populations to accept whatever centralized authority offers survival.
The ultimate political transaction, then. Your liberty in exchange for a drink of water.
That's the grim transaction the source material outlines, yeah. Enforced by the strategic elimination of a resource that is simultaneously essential for life and dangerously concentrated. #outro.
Wow, okay, that was quite a deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, connecting the hard numbers of water scarcity to some really extreme geopolitical theories.
We really did. We started with that shocking baseline fact that we rely on just 0.3% of Earth's water.
Right. And that 87% of that tiny fraction is concentrated in lakes, making them the key strategic targets.
Then we mapped out those 3 potential global choke points: the African Great Lakes, the Siberian Giants, and the North American Great Lakes. We looked at their volumes, who depends on them, and the different strategic implications of hitting each one.
Which led us to those 2 competing geopolitical views from the source. View 1. Target the superpower, the U.S., to break its resistance from within.
And view 2. Target the vulnerable, Africa, to preserve the superpower's infrastructure as a base for the new global regime while creating a massive diversion.
And finally, we explored that unsettling analogy from Genesis 47, used by the source to argue how engineered scarcity, extreme thirst, and hunger could be used to dismantle democracy and lead people to trade their freedom for survival, becoming dependent servants.
I think the absolute core insight here, the thing you really have to grapple with after looking at this analysis, is how much our global stability hinges on the concentration of our most vital resource. It's not just about the total amount of water, it's that so much of the usable stuff is in so few places.
That concentration is the real vulnerability.
It is. It makes these specific lake clusters incredibly high-impact targets. The failure of just one of those systems could trigger immediate systemic collapse, societal breakdown, mass migration, and, as the source argues, the perfect conditions for imposing authoritarian control.
It certainly reframes the whole idea of resource security or national security.
It really does. Which leads to, I think, the final provocative thought we should leave our listeners with.
Okay, what's that?
Well, we spend so much time, money, and political energy worrying about conflicts over oil or lithium or other resources, right?
Standard geopolitics.
But if this analysis is even remotely directionally correct about the strategic impact of water concentration, if losing a single cluster like the North American Great Lakes or the African Great Lakes could instantly destabilize hundreds of millions of people, then here's the question. Given that 87% of our readily usable surface water is sitting in just a handful of these giant lakes, what are we actually doing right now in terms of national and international security policy to address that specific vulnerability? Are we diversifying sources? Are we hardening protections? Or is this hyper-concentration blind spot in our strategic planning?
Is our current security thinking prepared for water being weaponized on this scale?
Exactly. Are we truly prepared for the strategic weaponization of water, given its unique geography? It's a question that I think demands a much more serious and urgent answer than it's currently getting.
Something to definitely think about. Until next time on The Deep Dive, keep digging into the details and stay aware of the real vulnerabilities and the potential costs of scarcity.